The first thing I heard was the crunch of boots on frost. Too many, too fast. The second was the roar overhead, low enough to rattle the glass. By the time I reached the tarmac fence, the air was thick with jet fuel and orders barked in Russian. Men were running toward something I couldn't see yet, rifles half raised, eyes locked forward. Then it appeared through the morning haze, an outline that shouldn't have been there, metal still trembling from the landing. No one moved for a full second, like the city itself had forgotten how to breathe. My coat pocket was heavy with the wrong kind of credentials. And I remember thinking, if this is what I think it is, nothing we've planned matters anymore. Before, I regret saying any of this. Hit that like button. Subscribe if this already feels wrong. Tell me your city. And the time, Moscow, January 1972. The runway was never meant for. Arrivals like his dot. The cold bit through my gloves as I stepped off the car. The smell of kerosene already clinging to the air. Sheremetyevo was awake in the worst way lights. Flooding the runway, sirens echoing off hangars. Soldiers standing where only ground crews usually loitered. I kept my hands visible. Here, even neutral observers got treated like suspects. They'd parked the F-4 Phantom at the far end, nose turned toward the terminal as if ready to taxi back to the west. The paint was clean, almost too clean, for a bird that had supposedly been flying for hours. I watched the canopy pop open, the hydraulic hiss cutting through the wind. The pilot climbed out slow, helmet in hand, hands raised high. His posture said, compliance, but his eyes scanning every movement around him said, assessment. They brought him past me, boots scuffing the icy tarmac. He didn't look at me, but his head turned a fraction too far toward the fuel. Trucks, I knew that look. He was cataloging exits. Inside the terminal's secure wing, the Soviets wasted no time. Interrogation rooms here weren't for comfort. They were boxes with metal chairs, a table bolted down, and a single bulb that hummed just enough to make you aware of your heartbeat. I stood behind the glass, the cold from outside still in my bones. He was still in his flight suit, gloves off now, fingers drumming slow on the table. They poured him tea, didn't offer sugar. He sipped without asking, as if he'd been here before. The colonel in charge leaned forward, voice low but sharp, tossing him questions in Russian. The pilot answered in English, calm and deliberate. Navigation failure, fuel low, emergency landing. That's what I was supposed to write down, navigation failure. But my pen paused. The pattern of his breathing didn't match his words slow, measured inhales, like a man pacing himself for something ahead. The Soviets pressed about his route. He claimed cloud cover, faulty compass, headwinds. I glanced at the wall clock. Even with all that, his flight path should have taken him nowhere near Moscow. And the Phantom had enough range to divert long before here. Between exchanges, he glanced toward the one-way mirror. Not a nervous glance, more like checking if the right person was listening. I knew the trick. You don't look directly at the glass, you look past it, like you're talking to someone behind a curtain. The colonel stepped out for a moment, muttering orders to the guard. I stayed in place. The pilot shifted in his chair, stretched his fingers, and adjusted his posture just enough to catch my eye through the reflection. He smiled, not the kind you give when you're relieved to be alive, but the kind that says, we're about to play a game, you and I. When the colonel returned, the questions turned to his cargo. The pilot claimed he'd left everything in the cockpit charts, radio logs, a sidearm. He described them like a man describing props on a stage. Detailed, but too rehearsed. They sent a crew to retrieve the items. I stayed behind the glass. The pilot leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, eyes half-lidded as if bored. But the smallest twitch of his jaw told me he was waiting for that moment when the door would open and anything would change. The crew returned. with a duffel and a sealed folder. The colonel rifled through the contents. Standard gear, nothing unusual, until he hit the sealed envelope marked in English. The pilot's gaze tightened, just for a fraction of a second, like someone bracing for a punch they'd seen coming. Noted it. The colonel didn't. That should have been the end of it. But then the elevator door opened. The elevator door opened, and a man in a dark coat stepped out, bringing with him the kind of cold that doesn't melt. He ignored the colonel, ignored the guards, and fixed his gaze on the mirror until it found me. 2 fingers lifted a signal. Nothing friendly. I entered the room without waiting for permission, taking the chair against the wall, close enough to smell jet fuel dried into the pilot's suit. The bulb hummed. The colonel introduced me as observer, which in this business means witness, or scapegoat. The pilot glanced over, measuring the corners of the room before looking back at his tea. There was relief in his posture, subtle but there. We were trained for everything except for that dot. I started with the basics: name, rank, unit. He gave me a base that existed, a call sign that didn't, and a squadron designation that had changed only last month. That last one meant someone had updated him recently. The colonel let me keep going. I asked about fuel. He answered to 1 decimal place. That wasn't panic. That was calibration. I slid a folded map toward him, a wax pencil on top. Show me. He drew an arc that treated restricted corridors like suggestions, clipped Moscow's outer ring, and settled neatly into Sheremetyevo. Too neat. I asked about cloud cover. Headwinds. He nodded through both. And fuel? Enough to taxi. He said, almost smiling. A guard came in with his duffel and a sealed envelope. The colonel wanted the gear first. I tapped the envelope. After a moment, he cut it open. Inside, typed pages in clumsy Russian. Training materials, supposedly. The grammar limped. The vocabulary was mismatched. It looked made to be caught. Read on. Halfway down, the page numbers skipped in a sequence to 5, 9, 14. A code, or at least bait for someone who knew how to look. I tapped each number with my pencil. The pilot watched my hand, not the page. You ever smell fresh paint and think someone's hiding something? I said, mostly to myself. The colonel grunted. I changed subject. What did you fly before? The Phantom? T-38? Instructor? He gave a name. I countered with the man's nickname. He agreed too fast. Then I said, Blackbird. His eyes didn't move, but the muscles around them tightened. We used to say, trust no one. Like a joke, it wasn't. Your emergency beacon, did it fail? Intermittent? Radio? Unreadable. And yet you landed here. He sipped tea. Then his left thumb brushed his index finger twice. Across the glass, a guard mirrored it. Not chance. Protocol. I poured him more tea, setting the cup just out of reach for his dominant hand. He reached anyway, then stopped, smiling faintly. I turned the pages over, tracing the type with a fingertip. Every 7th character leaned slightly, like it came from another machine. Printer cipher. Read diagonally, skip the crooked ones, fragments emerged. Unit names, timetables, coded instructions. Who are these for? I asked. Instructors? He looked at the steam from his cup. It started out like any other operation, until it didn't. He added, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. The colonel told me to stick to procedure. I ignored him. If someone believed, these papers, what would they do? Move missiles before dawn, he said, almost gently. Gently. That should have been the end of it. Seal the envelope. Shuffle us out. But then the guard outside pressed his thumb to the glass, leaving a greasy print like a signature. The pilot's eyes followed it. You're not here to verify me, he said quietly. You're here so I can verify you. And then the elevator started up again. The second set of footsteps from the elevator belonged to a junior officer with a stack of blank forms under his arm. He slipped into the room like a man walking into a crime scene too late to matter. The colonel waved him off, muttering something about paperwork later. I stayed where I was, across from the pilot, the envelope still open between us. They asked him to go over his flight path again, start to finish. Same story. Disorientation over the Baltic, cloud banks too dense for visual navigation, compass errors, headwinds. The words came in the same order, with the same pauses, like he'd memorized the lines in a language he barely needed to think about. I kept my eyes on the map he was redrawing. Every mark landed with military precision. No hesitation. No approximations dot by. The third retelling, I stopped listening to the content and started listening to the cadence. Pilots under stress slip switch tenses, repeat numbers, confuse bearings. He didn't. His lines intersected Moscow's airspace, exactly where the approach corridor was least monitored that morning. I knew because I'd seen the coverage reports 2 hours earlier. He couldn't have known. The colonel grew irritated, tapping the table for effect. The pilot ignored him, shading a small area on the map that didn't belong to the official route. I leaned forward. That zone Y, mark it? He glanced at me, then erased it with his sleeve, smudging graphite. Across the page. The colonel pretended not to notice, which meant he'd noticed plenty. The room's air was turning stale. A guard stepped in with fresh tea. The pilot used the distraction to roll the pencil between his fingers 3 times an old airfield. Signal for safe to speak. I didn't respond. I asked about his training routes. He mentioned bases in Arizona and Okinawa, but skipped over Guam. I brought it up myself, and for the first time, his hand froze midair. Too far for this trip, he said. Wrong direction. It wasn't. Back on the map, he circled his supposed point of navigational failure. The latitude was plausible. The longitude would have put him over a listening post we'd burned 3 years earlier. That was no accident. I wrote the coordinates down anyway, underlining them twice. Between notes, I caught the colonel watching me more than the pilot. He wasn't here to break this man. He was here to see how I reacted. That was a problem. The pilot leaned back, folding his arms. You ever been followed by someone who thinks they're good at it? He asked suddenly. The colonel barked for him to stick to the point. I didn't answer. We cycled through the questions a 4th time, each answer as neat as the last. It should have bored me, but patterns like that are only boring when they're true. His version was airtight because it had been engineered that way. The junior officer started packing up the papers, but I kept one map under my hand. You're precise, I said. Too precise, the pilot shrugged. Old habit. Outside, the wind shifted, and the smell of jet fuel thickened. The pilot's gaze moved to the window behind me, where nothing but darkness showed. Your turn, he said quietly. Tell me where you think I came from. The colonel stood, ending the session. The pilot didn't resist as they took him out, but his eyes stayed locked on mine until the door closed. That should have been the end of it. But when I looked down, the map under my hand had an extra set of coordinates drawn in while I wasn't looking. They put him in a holding room, 2 doors down, a guard at each end of the hall. I stayed behind in the glass booth, staring at those new coordinates. They didn't match any flight plan I knew. Not NATO, not Warsaw Pact, just a spot in the middle of nowhere west of Smolensk. No airfields, no stations, nothing on the maps. We were allowed to see. The colonel came back in, grumbling about how long this was taking. He ordered the pilot brought in again. This time, no tea, no map, just the 3 of us, and the low buzz of the light above. I asked him to explain the extra markings. He feigned confusion, looking to the colonel like I'd gone off script. That told me enough. We were both stepping outside the playbook now. Halfway through another navigation failure speech, it happened. He slipped. Just a word, 2 syllables in English. Crowhammer. It landed heavy in my head. That was a mission. Code reserved for black operations. The kind they don't list anywhere, not even in classified indexes. You either knew it from being in the room, or you didn't know it existed. I didn't react. He didn't repeat it. The colonel kept scribbling notes like he hadn't heard a thing, which was worse, because if he had heard it and ignored it, then he already knew what this was about. I leaned forward, elbows on the table. Say that again. He gave me a blank look, then switched to describing cloud formations over the Baltic, as if nothing had happened. I let him finish, but in my head the alarms were already ringing. During a pause, I took out my pen and clicked it twice, another field signal. He blinked once, slow. Not confirmation, not denial. Just acknowledgement. The colonel decided to end the session, telling the guards to return him to the holding room. As they pulled him to his feet, I saw his right hand curl slightly, thumb brushing the side of his palm, another microgesture. In training, we'd learned that one. It meant we're under observation. Wait. The corridor outside was empty, except for the echo of our steps. At the holding room door, one guard fumbled with the keys. The other kept his hand near his holster, but his eyes flicked toward me, just for a second. That was enough to remind me that every move here had at least 2 audiences. Back in the booth, I went over my notes. Crowhammer sat there like a landmine. If I put it in the official record, it would trigger alarms across agencies. If I left it out, I was burying evidence of a black mission. Either way, someone would notice later. I closed the folder. That should have been the end of it. But before I could lock it away, the phone on the wall rang once and then stopped. No call, just the ring. The ring still echoed in my ear when the colonel reappeared, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Inventory," he said, and waved for me to follow. We walked down to the secure storage where the pilot's effects had been dumped in labeled bins. Gloves, helmet, navigation kit, standard issue survival gear. And then the outlier, a black leather diplomatic briefcase with 2 combination locks and no visible scratches. It sat apart from the rest, like even the other evidence didn't want to be near it. The Soviet quartermaster tapped the locks with his pen. "We open?" he asked, looking at the colonel. There was a pause. "We open," the colonel replied. The quartermaster dialed through numbers like he'd done it 100 times, but the tumblers didn't budge. A second man tried a skeleton key. Nothing. That's when they called for the bolt cutters. When the jaws bit through the first lock, the pilot visible through the holding room's camera feed sat up straighter. No sound, no movement, just that subtle shift that says we've crossed a line. The second lock snapped, and the quartermaster popped the latches. Inside, a stack of documents, each in a clear plastic sleeve, labeled Training Protocols in Russian. But the language was off, verbs twisted, idioms wrong, punctuation like someone had translated from English, and then back again. I flipped through them slowly, page margins too wide, text alignment shifting subtly every few lines. It screamed deliberate imperfection. You don't need to be a codebreaker to know when something's meant to be caught. At the bottom of the stack was a folded sheet of graph paper with handwritten notes in English flight times, coordinates, and 2 underlined words. Northern route. That wasn't part of his official story. I slid it back in the sleeve before the colonel noticed. The quartermaster started photographing each page. As the camera clicked, I caught the faintest change in the typeface. Every 8th E had a different curve, barely visible unless you knew where to look. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Back in the hallway, the colonel asked if I'd seen anything unusual. I shrugged. Just bad Russian. He smirked, like he knew I was holding something back. That's when the guard at the far end stepped forward and handed him a slip of paper. The colonel read it, then looked at me. They want you in there again. I glanced at the monitor showing the pilot. He was sitting perfectly still, hands folded, eyes fixed on the door. That should have been the end of it. But the briefcase was still open on the table, and one page was missing. They led me back into the holding room. But this time, I didn't take the chair. I stood by the wall, the folder from the briefcase under my arm. The pilot didn't speak. He just watched me, like he was measuring the air between us. The colonel stayed by the door, letting the silence hang heavy. I laid the folder on the table, opened it to the missing page. This was in your case, I said. It wasn't in the inventory. He glanced at it, then back at me, unfazed. Wasn't mine. Before I could press further, he lifted his left hand slightly, just enough to brush the side of his thumb against his forefinger. From the corner of my eye, I saw the guard in the hallway's reflection mimic the same gesture. It was subtle, precise, and absolutely not improvisation. Protocol. I stepped closer. Who's that signal for? He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Not you. Then he reached for his cup, drank, and set it down with the handle pointing. Toward the mirror another signal, one I didn't recognize. The colonel finally moved, taking the seat across from him. We can keep this going all night, he said in Russian. The pilot replied in English, not if your friend outside runs out of nerve. The colonel didn't flinch, which meant he understood perfectly. The tension was building, but it wasn't the loud kind. It was the kind where you realize the real conversation isn't the one you're hearing. I tried to shift it. Those coordinates you marked earlier, Smolensk. What's there? He smiled faintly. Snow. The colonel cut the session, but as they walked him back to his cell, the pilot slowed just enough to tap the wall with 2 fingers. I stayed behind, staring at the spot he'd touched. There was nothing there except maybe a camera, or a bug, or a memory meant to be left behind. Back in the observation room, I rewound the tape from earlier. The guard's mirrored gesture, the handle on the cup, the tap on the wall, it wasn't random. It was a sequence. But without the key, I couldn't read it. And if I could, I wasn't sure I wanted to. That should have been the end of it. But when I looked up, the guard was gone, and so was the page from the folder. I didn't bother asking who had taken the page. In a place like this, missing evidence was just another line item. Instead, I spread the remaining documents out under the desk lamp. The paper looked ordinary enough, but the typeface wasn't uniform. Every so often, the curve of an E or the angle of a T was slightly off, as if the machine had been adjusted mid-sentence. I'd seen this before, years earlier in a debrief room in Ankara. It was a trick for embedding ciphertext inside something banal. The shift was mechanical, deliberate. All you needed was the key to know which letters mattered. I didn't have the key, but patterns have a way of showing themselves to people who've spent their lives looking for them. Every 8th irregular character lined up into a new string nonsense at first, until I realized they were map coordinates. I traced them on a classified Soviet chart. They formed a path, not a 0.3 locations in sequence, ending just south of Minsk. It didn't match any training route. More importantly, it lined up exactly with known Soviet radar blind spots. The colonel walked in as I was making the last mark. He said nothing, just looked over my shoulder, grunted, and left. That was worse than any question, because it meant he'd seen the pattern too, and had decided to let me sit with it. The pilot came back in under heavier guard. I slid the chart toward him. That's not the path of someone who got lost, I said. He studied it, expression unchanged, then asked for tea. While the cup was being poured, he said softly, "Sometimes the safest place to hide is where everyone's looking." The colonel cut in, asking him directly what the coordinates meant. The pilot took a sip, eyes on me. Depends who's asking. I leaned forward. If someone followed this route, where would they end up? He didn't answer. Instead, he tapped his finger 3 times on the table. I looked at the guard. He did the same, just slower. I wasn't part of this conversation, only its witness. When they escorted him out again, I noticed he'd left a small tear in the chart, right over the second location. Not an accident. I folded the map and slid it into my coat. That should have been the end of it. But when I turned back to the desk, the lamp was off, and no one else was in the room. I kept the folded map in my coat pocket, feeling its edge every time I moved. The building was quieter now, most of the noise coming from the hum of ventilation and the occasional clack of boots on concrete. I found an empty office, shut the door, and spread the map across the desk. The tier over the second location lined up perfectly with a notation in my own memory. A disused weather station that had once doubled as a listening post. We'd abandoned it, or so we thought. Running the route in reverse, it made no sense for a lost pilot. But for a courier, it was. Perfect. 3 stops. Each one in range of someone who could pick up a package or drop one off without triggering alarms. The more I stared at it, the more one thought lodged itself in my head. He wasn't here by accident, and he wasn't here to defect. He was here to deliver. Deliver what was the question that kept me from tossing the whole theory aside. If it was intel for the Soviets, why fly a Phantom into Moscow? That's a suicide mission. Unless the delivery wasn't for the Soviets at all, but for the people watching how the Soviets would react. If those documents in his briefcase were designed to be found, then maybe they weren't warnings. They were bait. Bait meant to provoke a response big enough to be noticed by satellites and analysts back home. You plant the wrong information in the right place. Watch your opponent move their pieces, and you learn exactly how they think war will start. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. If I was right, then I was sitting in the middle of an operation meant to fake the start of a nuclear exchange just to measure reaction time. That's the kind of thing no one admits to. Even decades later, the door creaked open. The colonel stepped inside, closing it behind him. He didn't ask what I'd found. He just said, "You're thinking too much like him." I didn't answer. He left without another word. I folded the map again, slipping it back into my coat. This wasn't a theory I could put in a report. Reports get read. Reports get archived. Reports get leaked. That should have been the end of it. But as I stepped into the hallway, the pilot was already there, flanked by 2 guards. And he was smiling. They'd brought him into a smaller room this time. No windows, no clock, just the smell of old smoke trapped in the walls. A single lamp lit the table from above, throwing our shadows long and uneven across the floor. The colonel stayed outside, which meant this session was mine alone. The pilot sat with his wrists cuffed to the table, the metal biting into the fabric of his flight suit. I slid the map in front of him, folded so only the second location showed. "You know where this is?" I asked. He didn't look down. "Do you?" I leaned in. If those papers are taken seriously, missiles get moved. Early, fast, and when missiles move, people notice. That's the point, isn't it? He tilted his head slightly, studying me like I'd just revealed my own assignment. "Not every war starts with a shot," he said quietly. "Sometimes it starts with the right photograph in the wrong hands." I tapped the map. "You're telling me these coordinates are a photo op?" A faint smile. "You see what you want to see." I let the silence grow until the air felt heavy. Then I asked, "Do you know what happens if I tell them what I think this is?" His smile didn't fade. "Same thing that happens if you don't." For the first time that night, I felt the weight of the choice sitting in front of me. If I confirmed his story to the Soviets, they'd tear him apart before morning. If I stayed quiet, I'd be complicit in whatever game was being played, one that could tip over into something we couldn't pull back from. He broke the silence first. We're both just middlemen here. The real players aren't in this room. The guard outside coughed, a short, deliberate sound. The pilot's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to me. You still think you're the one asking questions? I closed the map, slid it back into my pocket. I think you're counting on me to do the wrong thing. That's the beauty of it, he said, leaning back as far as the cuffs allowed. There is no right thing. That should have been the end of it. But when I stepped into the hallway, the colonel was waiting with the briefcase in his hands. The colonel set the briefcase on the desk between us like it was a live device. No words, just the sound of the latches snapping open. Inside, the documents were gone. In their place was a single manila envelope, unsealed. He slid it toward me. Inside, 8 photographs, black and white, high contrast. All of them grainy. Shots of missile transporters on snowy roads, some clearly Soviet, others harder to place. Each had a handwritten date in the corner, all within the next 72 hours. I knew enough to recognize the problem. Those dates hadn't happened yet. The colonel's eyes were fixed on me. You understand what this means, he said. I didn't answer. He continued. Langley sent him with this. They want Moscow to think the launch window is already open. I stared at the photos. So it's fake. Of course it's fake, the colonel said. But not for them. For us, it took a second for that to sink in. This wasn't about tricking the Soviets into moving missiles. It was about watching how they moved them and when. Every convoy shifted, every silo door tested, would be logged by satellites and turned into a map of their readiness. It was a chess match where the first move was a bluff designed to be spotted. I asked him why he was telling me this. He didn't blink, because someone has to decide whether to play along. The room felt smaller. If I said nothing, I was an accessory to a provocation that could spiral in hours. If I spoke up, I'd be confirming to the Soviets that the United States was running Black Ops out of its own military cockpit. Either path ended with someone's finger closer to a button. I closed the envelope, slid it back into the case. You're asking me to choose between escalation and exposure, I said. The colonel shrugged. You're the one they sent. Make it count. I looked toward the holding cell feed. The pilot was sitting still, staring directly at the camera. Like he knew this conversation was happening. That should have been the end of it. But then the feed went dark. The screen stayed black for a full 10 seconds before the signal returned. When it did, the camera angle had shifted slightly higher, as if someone had adjusted it. The pilot was still there, but now his hands were flat on the table, palms down, waiting. I stepped into the hallway, the colonel trailing behind me. He's ready to talk, the guard said. We went in together. The pilot's eyes moved between us, slow and deliberate. You've seen the photos, he said. Not a question. I kept my voice steady. You know what they'll do if I hand those over? He nodded. And you know what they'll do if you don't. The colonel broke in. This is not a negotiation. Either you confirm his story to us, or you don't. There is no middle. I ignored him. Why me? Because, the pilot said, you still believe there's a middle. He wasn't wrong. If I told the Soviets the photos were fabricated, they might stand down, or they might take it as proof we were trying to buy time before a real strike. If I kept my mouth shut, I'd be helping orchestrate a provocation designed to measure their panic in minutes. You think you're outside this? The pilot asked. You're in it the moment you decide what not to say. The colonel pushed back from the table. Enough. He ordered the guards to take the pilot out. As they pulled him to his feet, he turned his head toward me and said, "Whatever you choose, you won't live long enough to know if it was right." When the door shut, the colonel leaned in close. "We can pin this on you, or we can make you disappear from it entirely. Choose carefully." I didn't answer. My mind was on the map in my coat, the coordinates still burned into memory, and the photographs that could ignite the most dangerous misunderstanding of my career. That should have been the end of it. But when I checked my coat pocket, the map was gone. The storm had eased, but the air still carried that heavy, metallic cold. I stepped out onto the edge of the tarmac, scanning the far end where a single truck idled under dim lights. 2 guards flanked the pilot, one gripping his arm, the other holding a folder that didn't belong to him. They walked slow, deliberate, the kind of pace that says the outcome's already decided. The pilot's flight suit hung looser now, his helmet gone, his eyes fixed forward, until, halfway to the truck, he turned just enough to find me in the shadows. No smile this time, no coded gesture, just a steady look that felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The colonel stepped beside me without a word. We watched as the rear doors closed, muffling whatever sound the pilot might have made. The engine revved, and the truck pulled away, its taillights fading into the snow. That should have been the end of it. But years later, I still see that look in dreams I don't want to wake from. I left Moscow a week later on a flight that rattled more than I liked. The city fell away under the wing, its gray streets disappearing into the same snow that had swallowed the truck. No report I wrote mentioned his name. No file I saw afterward confirmed he ever existed. Over the years, fragments surfaced, an intercepted transmission here, an unmarked photo there, but nothing that tied up the thread. Maybe that was the point. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that single engine in my head, the one that carried him out of Sheremetyevo. I don't know if he ever reached his destination. I'm not even sure I want to, because if he did, it means the rest of us were only pieces moved to clear his path. And if he didn't, well, maybe we were the path. If you stayed until the end, you already know too much. Share this before someone decides it shouldn't be heard. And tell me, if it were you in that room, what would you have done?